Welcome back to The Explainer. If you're ready for a focused, structured look at one of history's darkest and most fascinating corners, you are absolutely in the right place. Today, we're taking a historical true crime journey straight into the grim reality of the 19th century medical black market. We're going to examine a bizarre time when the desperate pursuit of life-saving medical knowledge clashed directly with the sanctity of the grave. We're exploring the era of the resurrection men. We're going to break down exactly how this macabre trade actually functioned, the unbelievable legal loopholes that allowed it to thrive, and the terrifying escalation that finally brought the whole system crashing down.
Okay, let's dive into this bizarre, darkly comedic paradox that fueled the entire body-snatching trade. I mean, it sounds like a riddle, right? Why would a justice system completely ignore the theft of human remains, but absolutely throw the book at someone who stole the cheap linen wrapping those remains? Understanding the answer to this incredibly strange question is the absolute key to understanding how the resurrection men operated so openly and, honestly, so successfully for years.
Section 1. The bizarre legal loophole. So, picture this. It's the 19th century. A massive boom in medical schools and anatomy classes creates a skyrocketing demand for bodies. And this demand was met right out in the open, all because of a glaring, almost unbelievable quirk in English common law. You see, a dead body belonged to absolutely no one. Because a corpse wasn't legally considered property, you couldn't technically steal it. You just can't steal something nobody owns. So the courts kind of had to invent a lesser charge. They called it outraging public decency. This was just a mere misdemeanor. If a resurrection man got caught dragging a corpse out of a graveyard, the absolute worst he faced was a super brief stint in jail or a small fine. And here's the real kicker. The medical schools, who were completely desperate for fresh cadavers to teach their students, would usually just pay that fine for him. It was literally just the cost of doing business. The risk was incredibly low.
And this brilliantly illustrates the utter absurdity of the situation. Stealing the actual human corpse, slap on the wrist, small fine. But stealing the clothes, the shrouds, or the jewelry wrapped around that corpse, oh, that was a completely different story. Those items were considered the legal property of the deceased's family. If you took the shroud, you were committing grand larceny. The punishment for that? You could actually be hanged by the neck until dead, or shipped off on a boat to a penal colony for the rest of your life.
Section 2. Escaping the hangman's noose.
This extreme contrast in the law basically wrote the rulebook for exactly how the body snatchers operated. They had to navigate this loophole absolutely perfectly in the dead of night. Because, think about it, a single mistake, leaving with just one piece of legal property, meant trading a tiny fine for the gallows. During what was known as the midnight harvest, these crews didn't just grab a body and run. No way. They had to be meticulous. When they dug down into a fresh grave, they carefully stripped every single body entirely naked right there in the dirt. Every sheet, every scrap of clothing, every cheap tin ring had to be pulled off and tossed right back into the coffin before they filled the hole back up. I mean, yes, they were professional criminals, but they were remarkably compliant with property law. They left all the legal property behind to make completely sure that if the night watch caught them on the road back to the city, they were only holding a worthless, legally unowned corpse.
Section 3. Graveyards under heavy guard. But you obviously can't run an operation like this forever without people noticing. As families finally caught on that their loved ones were ending up on anatomy tables, they were furious, and they started a defensive arms race to protect the dead. Communities started pooling their money to buy mort safes. These were massive, incredibly heavy iron cages bolted directly over fresh graves. You literally could not dig through them. Other towns organized community watches, hiring armed night watchmen to patrol the burial grounds with lanterns and muskets. And honestly, these new heavy defenses did exactly what they were supposed to do. They made the traditional graveyard raiding business highly inefficient, incredibly dangerous, and just vastly more difficult. But here's the problem. The medical schools were still paying top dollar. The demand hadn't changed at all, only the supply had been restricted.
Section 4. From robbery to murder. Let's move to and see how this builds, because this is where our explainer takes a really dark shift. When a highly lucrative black market suddenly loses its easy supply, the people involved don't just, quit and find honest work. We go from simple grave robbing, exploiting that legal loophole we just talked about, to society reacting with iron cages and watchmen. This completely tightens the supply. And that restriction forces the market to adapt, leading directly to the horrifying escalation of the 1828 Burke and Hare murders. It's a grim, almost inevitable progression of unregulated supply and demand, ending finally with a legislative response in 1832. Let's look a little closer at that horrifying 1828 escalation.
So, it's 1828 in Edinburgh,
and William Burke and William Hare make a chilling realization. Waiting for people to die naturally, and then trying to bypass heavy iron cages and freezing graveyards while dodging armed guards, it was just way too inefficient. So they decided to create their own supply. Their method was brutal, but unfortunately, highly effective. They ran a boarding house, which made it super easy for them to lure poor, vulnerable travelers right off the street. They'd get these victims heavily intoxicated, and then they'd suffocate them. The suffocation was the key part here. It left the body completely pristine, with no obvious wounds that would raise any red flags at the anatomy lab.
16. That is the exact number of quote-unquote fresh bodies William Burke and William Hare manufactured and sold directly to a very prominent anatomy lecturer named Dr. Robert Knox. They bypassed the graveyards entirely, creating a horrifying direct-to-consumer pipeline of murder. And Dr. Knox, whether he asked questions or not, paid handsomely for bodies that were, well, remarkably fresh. Burke and Hare made an absolute fortune before they were finally caught and stopped.
And the truly terrifying thing here is that this wasn't even an isolated incident. The market forces were so wildly strong that the idea spread like wildfire. Shortly after Burke and Hare, a totally separate gang known as the London Burkers was caught doing the exact same thing down in England. Only their targets were arguably even more tragic. They were actually murdering homeless children to supply the booming medical market. The entire system was completely broken. The desperate demand for medical knowledge was actively, literally incentivizing the slaughter of the absolute poorest, most vulnerable people in society.
Section 5. The Anatomy Act of 1832.
The sheer horror of these murders and the copycats that followed deeply shocked the British public. The outrage was absolutely palpable. The government couldn't turn a blind eye anymore, so Parliament finally stepped in to structurally fix the market. In 1832, they passed the Anatomy Act, and this changed the core rules of supply and demand, effectively killing the resurrection trade overnight. First, they abolished the really outdated rule that said only executed murderers could be dissected. Second, and way more consequentially, the act allowed medical schools legal, regulated access to quote-unquote unclaimed bodies. By providing this massive, completely legal alternative source for cadavers, the price of a black market body plummeted to absolute zero. The resurrection men were instantly put out of business forever.
So the crucial point is understanding exactly who these unclaimed bodies actually were. The black market of grave robbing and murder was over, yes, but the unclaimed were mostly the poor, the destitute, the marginalized folks who died in workhouses or charity hospitals without family who could afford to pay for a proper burial. The state simply scooped them up and handed their remains right over to the anatomists.
Which leaves us to ponder a pretty heavy final question. The illegal trade was dead, for sure, but at what cost to the vulnerable poor? The government solved the crime wave, absolutely, but they did so by legally institutionalizing the dissection of the lower classes. It's a massive ethical gray area. It means at the very foundation of modern medical science, the early advancements in anatomy and surgery that you and I benefit from today were effectively paid for by exploiting those at the absolute bottom of 19th century society. It's a haunting reality to consider, isn't it? Something to think about the next time you visit a doctor. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.